So today's weather is going to be about. Wait a minute, just breaking. Free Dungeons and Dragons, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide for free here today on RPG Boons. Hello, everybody. Welcome to RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. I am Don Franco 3, the Busy Person's GM, and today we're going to talk about free Dungeons and Dragons. That's right. I wasn't lying. You didn't click for no reason. But I also want to talk a little bit about something I always say, that you only need the player's handbook to play Dungeons and Dragons. So for today's RPG boons, we're going to take another one of those bonus boons. We're going to take that previous video for level 0 characters and dungeon masters, and today we're going to gain some XP, get a little more inside depth on what's in the player's handbook. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you a few things on Dungeons and Dragons Player's Handbook that you need to know as the Dungeon Master and as a player in general, but more specifically for the Dungeon Master because you need to know those rules. The only thing you really needed from the Player's Handbook is to read Chapter 7, Using Your Ability Scores, Chapter 9, Combat, and Chapter 10, Spellcasting. So for Chapter 7, it's pages 173 to 179. That's 7 pages. For Chapter 9, it's pages 189 to 198. That's 10 pages. And for Chapter 10, it's pages 201 to 205. That's 5 pages. And in Chapter 8, the adventuring section, you only really need to look at page 186, which talks about short rest and long rest. Now, it's important to understand that the entire book is important, right? But certain sections are more important than others to get started playing the game. So chapter 7, 9, and 10 are very important for you to start playing the game. So before we start thinking that's a lot of information and a lot of pages to read, I mean, let's skim through this really quick. You'll notice that some of these pages also have pictures in them, so that takes away a lot of the text. So it's not as overwhelming as you think. The other important thing I want to point out is that this isn't any different in other games, right? So if we look at the rules for Risk here, we can see that it's clearly 16 pages, and we can quickly scroll through those pages, and you can see there's a lot of rules associated with that, as well as some pictures. And I would argue this might even have more text than the player's handbook does currently. And then the final thing I want to mention is there's these things called Dungeon Master screens. So if you're ever concerned about having to memorize this stuff, you don't really have to memorize all of it. Here's a PDF of the Dungeon Master screen, and you can clearly see as I pan through it, all the skills, all the different actions in combat, the different things for jump, high jump, conditions, deft, frightened. All these things are listed in the Dungeon Master screen, and you can use this as a reference at all times. So if you feel like buying that Dungeon Master screen, you can do that, or you can actually find some free versions of these online. Take a picture of those, copy and paste them onto a PowerPoint, and then you'll have them ready to use at any time. Well, the last thing I want to talk about is what's in those chapters. Chapter 7, of course, is using your abilities. Chapter 9, combat. Chapter 10, spell casting. And of course, that little small section, 1 or 2 paragraphs in Chapter 8. When you think about how many pages you actually have to know, that's 7 plus 10, 17. 17 plus 5 is 22, so about 22 pages. I just showed you that the risk rules are about 16 pages, so not really that much to understand the basic mechanics of the game. So in chapter 7, they'll discuss things such as difficulty class, which is basically the number that is used to determine how hard it is for you to do something. They'll also talk about advantage and disadvantage. That's when you roll 2 20-sided dice and you either choose the highest or the lowest. They'll talk about your strength, dexterity, constitution, all your ability scores, how to use those, what kind of skills are related to those. Then again, chapter 8 will have that short couple paragraphs about the short rest and the long rest. And then let's go back to that character sheet. I mentioned to you guys their ability scores. And so if we're looking at here, we're looking at strength, you get a +2 to your roll. Remember, you're rolling that D20 dice, that 20-sided dice. You can add +2 bonus to that number. That's really going to improve your chances. If you're very dexterous, you have a +3 and so forth. So all these are bonuses that you can apply to the various types of roles associated with these ability scores, as well as we have skills listed here. And these are things that you'll choose on your own to try to kind of flavor your own character to really make a customized character. In chapter 9, they talk about combat, all the orders, the ordering combat, the action, bonus actions, move, reaction stuff we already mentioned in the previous video. Damage effects, critical hits, what is that? ×2 damage, vulnerabilities, ×2 damage from incoming attacks. Resistances is when you basically half the damage, and immunities, you take no damage. There's really not that many things that a player can do. I'm showing you here right next to the character sheet the kind of things you might want to consider doing, which is attack or cast a spell. That's an action. Sometimes you want to dash to move your speed again, basically move 30 again. Then we have these other things such as disengage, hide, shove, which are less commonly used. Disengage sometimes when you're trying to get away from an opponent to make sure they don't hit you. But essentially, most of the time you're going to be doing your attack or casting spell. You'll be looking at your character sheet, trying to figure out what kind of weapon do I want to use. So what about casting the spell? That's what that final chapter that I told you guys you should read. Chapter 10, spell casting. We mentioned earlier, every spell basically has very few components to it. There's a casting time, there's a range, there's a components, there's duration, verbal, somatic, and material. And if you remember, verbal is just you chanting words. Somatic is you hand waving, very much like Doctor Strange does. And material is something you either grab from a pouch, a chicken's leg I mentioned earlier, a feather perhaps, or in the case of fireball, we have a tiny ball of bat guano and sulfur to essentially cast this fireball. Right after the 4 components I just mentioned, there's a description of how exactly the spell works. This is something the player should know and definitely the dungeon master understand. But again, the dungeon master doesn't have time to memorize hundreds of spells, but he should understand the text and know how they work. In chapter 10, they also showed you the type of spells and what kind of effects they have. Is it a line of sight attack, a cone, a cube, a sphere? In the case of the fireball, it appears to be a sphere. And then you can kind of make strategic combat moves to try to determine how you want to use those spells. So I keep saying you only need the player's handbook to play Dungeons and Dragons. The reason I say that is because there's monster stats at the very end of the book. Let me show you real quick. Okay, so I jump forward to the appendix section, which is part of the book that a lot of people just don't read, but I really recommend always look at the appendix, especially with Dungeons and Dragons. They have some cool stuff back there. Here we're looking at Appendix A. It has a list of all the conditions in case you need a quick reference. Here is Appendix B. It has a bunch of gods that you can use, all with different beliefs and different areas of Dungeons and Dragons that these gods may exist. Appendix C of the Player's Handbook, Planes of Existence. How cool is that? Now you can go traveling the multiverse. Keep scrolling. And here it is, Appendix D, creature, statistics, and there's a few of them. So if you just want to have a very basic game of Dungeons and Dragons, it's not really that basic because there are some monsters here. But if you want to have just a really simple game, don't overcomplicate it with a bunch of monsters. All you need is a player's handbook. This is going to take about 5 seconds, but let me just show you the monsters in this last section. Okay, we have bat, boar, different bears. We have a cat, crocodiles, dire wolves. We have hawks, giant spiders, imps, giant eagles, lions, massive mules, owls, panthers, pseudo dragon, poisonous snake, quasit, raven, rat, reef shark, riding horse, skeleton, sprite, which is a little fairy, tiger, wolf, warhorse, zombie. Just about anything you need to really just have a very basic game. I do recommend the monster manual. However, a lot of times you can just do quick Google searches and pull up monster stat blocks. But if you don't know the name of the most popular monsters in that book, you'll have a hard time trying to find those stat blocks. Player's Handbook, yes, the only book you really need to play, and in fact has all the rules to play the game, while everything else has suggestions, such as the Dungeon Master's Guide. And the Monster Manual has just a list of a lot more monsters. So if you stood to this video this long, here's it. I'm going to show you how to get a free player's handbook, Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual. It's not going to be as pretty as the book because the book has all the pictures, but you can get all the rules, all the stats, for the monsters, magic weapons, and all the characters. I should have a link posted at the bottom of the screen, as well as in the description section, that you can click on and go get your copy of those three. It's one PDF, but it has all three of those books in there, the very bare essentials. Well, that's it, everybody. That's today's RPG Boons, our bonus boon, where we talked a little more in depth about the player's handbook, how to build those characters, how to DM, as well as how to get a free copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide, Player's Handbook, and the Monster Manual. Thank you for tuning in. I hope it was useful. Please hit the subscribe button, the notification bell, and I'll catch you next time.